Welcome back guys, JimmyJules153 here again with another Dreams Logic tutorial. Today we'll be looking at how to do a stop motion animation. We'll be using sculpts for this, and making the sculpt frames visible one by one really fast with a pulsar. You can see here that the sphere looks like it's splitting into two, and then reforms again with the original shape. We'll jump into edit mode, and first we'll take a quick look at the logic chip driving this and how it works, so you can use it for yourselves. I've made this chip remixable, so we'll go through each of the steps to make something like this. You can see that this is all running off a few selectors and a very fast pulsing timer. This timer is plugged into a calculator which is set to greater than 0. Basically, as soon as the timer outputs a signal, it'll make the calculator output a pulse, and that pulse then resets the timer, which starts the process over again. This setup will get you 1.5 frames for every 1 frame you get with the fastest timer. This may not sound like much, but it adds up to be 15 frames per second, compared to just 10 with the timer set to 0.1 seconds by itself. It'll turn on and off every frame that the logic updates, and because the logic updates at 30 times a second, this will pulse at 15 times a second. Our 30 times a second is cut in half, because the signal needs to be off for a frame between the signals, otherwise it'll be considered continuous and won't increment the selectors. These selectors are just set up to go through the first, then the second, and then the third, and you can easily expand on this by just copying the bottom setup and putting it beneath. You can see that the green nodes are incrementing the selectors and lighting up bright one by one, and the ones that are pulsing with less vibrancy are turned off. This gives us more outputs than are usually available on a single selector. So if we wanted to expand this, we could just copy the selector, node, exclusive OR gate, the frame delay, and the node that's plugged into port A as well. Then all you would need to do is copy the selector above and where the things plug in. Then you'd have another selector to plug more frames into. We'll quickly go through the frame delay here too. This is using the same frame update logic as our really fast pulse. It's just delaying the signal by a frame or two, so our selector doesn't skip past the first output. If this isn't in here, it'll miss the A port completely. Once it gets to the last frame of our animation, in this case the H port on the third selector, it'll pulse the reset node, which sets all of the selectors back to port A. These exclusive OR gates are just here so that the pulse to the selector gets turned off again after it reaches the end. If we add more selectors underneath this, we'd also just need to make sure that we plug in the reset port into the A input, just like the others, to reset the additional selectors that we add. Now that we've been through the logic, we'll go through how you would make something that looks like this. We'll copy this microchip here and start fresh. We'll turn on the studio lighting so we can actually see what's going on, and we'll jump straight into sculpt mode. We'll grab out a sphere and turn on the grid to make things nice and easy, and we'll turn the blend amount for the sphere up a lot. This will be our first frame of the animation. We'll also need a way to increment the outputs during this, so I'll quickly add a switch that we can use to do that. You won't need to add this, it'll be in the chip already for you. I'm hooking this up to a signal manipulator that's set to pulse when the signal turns on and when it turns off, so we don't have to press our switch twice for every frame that we want to increment. We also don't want it switching frames at 15 times a second while we're trying to do this, so we'll just switch the timer off while we're doing it. You can see that initially, port A is active on our first selector. We're going to plug this into the visibility of the sculpt, so it'll only be visible when the port on the selector is turned on. We're now going to duplicate this sculpt in the exact same spot, so we've got a copy of it. We're done with our first frame now, so we don't need to see it anymore. We can make it invisible just by incrementing the selectors with our switch. We'll press this and now we'll only be seeing the clone of our first frame that we can edit. Now that our selector's on the next port, we can plug that port into our next sculpt's visibility port and modify it. For the next frame, we're going to scope into the clone of the sculpt, and with the grid turned down a bit so we can make some finer adjustments, we'll duplicate our original sphere and move it up slightly, so that it soft blends with our other sphere. We'll continue this process and duplicate the sculpt, then increment the selector output, and then plug in the visibility. Now for this next edit of the sculpt, we can directly grab the cloned sphere and move it up slightly. You can see that we can actually grab both of the spheres that we've made and move them around individually. We'll go through this once more and then I'll speed it up a bit. We'll plug the active selector port into the next clone's visibility port, then jump in and move this top sphere slightly up. Then once again we'll jump out, clone, increment, and change the sculpt. Just note that if you're using this chip, don't plug anything into the J port, because that port activates the next selector. That is unless the J port is your last port. We'll continue this until we've got all the frames in the order that we want them, and hooked up to the selector ports. This is thermometer heavy, so you won't be able to do anything huge with this, because each sculpt is individual in the thermometer's eyes, because we've modified it. I've still got the other stop motion setup running in the background though, so it's not just this sculpt that's taking up the graphics thermo. Once we've got all our frames and we're happy, we can test it by turning the timer back on and hitting play. We've got some extra selector ports here that are buggering this up, so we'll quickly go through how to shrink this down to the right amount of ports. All we need to do is delete any unused selectors and the gadgets that go with them. Then we've plugged the last port into the reset node and the exclusive OR gate. When we hit play, the selectors will go through one by one, then reset back to the first port when it gets to the end. You can find this chip under my Dreams profile, JimmyJules153. It's called Stop Motion Logic. That's all for this one, guys. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.